Hi everybody, and welcome to our talk on the deep sea, also known as the abyss, just like that movie that probably none of you have seen because you're way too young. But if you want to go see it, it's actually pretty cool. They go to the abyss, the bottom of the ocean, they find aliens. Anyway, classic movie if you want to check that out. Otherwise, let's get started with the actual abyss that we're going to be talking about today, the deep sea. So remember when we talk about the deep sea, there are different levels of the ocean. We've talked a lot about the epipelagic. Remember, pelagic means open ocean, right? That big open water column. That's when we're talking about the pelagic. When you're talking about the epipelagic, you're talking about the top of the pelagic. You're talking about the mesopelagic, that's kind of in the middle. Then you're getting lower and lower into the bathypelagic. Finally, then you're in the abyssopelagic, meaning just over the abyssal plain, the really deep sea floor. And then if you actually get down into one of these deep sea canyons, one of these crevices and cracks, like the Marianas Trench, that's when you actually get into what's known as hadopelagic or abyssopelagic. But we're going to talk about that in just a second. So let's continue on this. Again, you do not have to actually know the specific depths, but you do need to know the order. So starting on the top, and this is a little bit hard to see. Hang on, technical difficulties. So this is, again, what you need to know. You need to know the order of these, not necessarily the actual depths, like what the numbers are, just necessarily the order. So starting at the very top, again, we have this epipelagic. That would be in the blue right there. That's a really well-lit area, lots of sun, lots of photosynthesis. Any organism that eats any of those photosynthetic organisms, they're all going to be like mostly in the epipelagic area right there. After the epipelagic, you're going to go down into the mesopelagic. Mesopelagic is known as the twilight zone. So the epipelagic is the photic zone, meaning photo, meaning light. And the mesopelagic is kind of the twilight zone. It does have some light penetrate, at least especially the upper mesopelagic. So you will have some light, but it also it does brighten up just a little bit during the day and then darkens at night. So that's, again, twilight, because there is a little bit of fluctuation. You can see a little bit of light in that mesopelagic, not like the epipelagic, which is the true photic zone, the one that has all the light. Once you get down into the bathypelagic zone, now you are in complete darkness. So the bathypelagic zone is going to have slightly different characteristics than the mesopelagic zone because there's no twilight. There's no light whatsoever as soon as you get to the bathy and the abyss zone. Now, the bathy is an interesting zone because it's mid-water column, but it has very little oxygen, very little light, well, no light. So very little like primary producers, anything like the base of that food chain level, you're going to have very little organisms in this bathypelagic zone. But once you actually get down to the abyssopelagic zone and the abyss, the bottom, you're going to have all sorts of new food sources because you actually have a bottom. So as those little particles and those little dead bodies and stuff float down to the bottom, once you hit the bottom, now you have that little food reserve. But when you're in the bathypelagic, you don't have that. So it's quite difficult to live in the bathypelagic. And again, the Hadal zone would be right inside here. That would be like a deep sea trench, like the Marianas Trench. So anything that's below the bottom of the sea. So this is the bottom of the sea, but in the bottom of the sea, there's a crack or a crevice or a big canyon. That would be like the Marianas Trench or the Hadal zone. Anything that's really deep sea, lower than the bottom. So you can almost think of like, you know, we're on ground level, right? And then you have like the Grand Canyon that takes you even farther down into there. Kind of the same thing like that, but underwater and very deep. Now, again, life in the deep sea is difficult. It's really difficult to live in this kind of area, mostly because there's not a lot of food. You don't have a ton of food floating around in the middle of the ocean, especially if everything's based off of the food chain, and the food chain starts with primary producers, like organisms that can do photosynthesis. You don't have a lot of that in the bathypelagic zone, in the middle of the ocean, because it's really dark and again, not a lot of areas for primary producers. So food is kind of a big deal. Also, unlike, you know, any area where there's a benthos, a bottom, you can't have stuff that floats to the bottom and then you catch it once it's on the bottom. So in the middle of the ocean, you're not going to have those deposit feeders, and that's something we talked about last week when we talked about the open ocean. So you're living in a very dark, very food-poor environment where you don't want to sink too far. You don't want to be eaten because anything is food if you're living there. There's not a lot of food available, so anything that you find, you better be able to eat, kind of thing. So it's really kind of a dangerous environment, this deep sea environment. Now, when I say dangerous, most of these organisms are very small, and that's something that most people think of. They think, oh, the deep sea, these organisms are huge. And that is true when we get to the abyssal plain and the Hadal zone, but it's not true when you're in the meso and the bathypelagic. These organisms are actually really small. So we're going to talk about that and how it's actually really not so scary, at least for larger organisms like us. Now, most of the time, there is plenty of oxygen. If you think of the open ocean, right, it's so exposed to oxygen, right, from the natural air, that it's going to get diffused into the water. As the waves turns it around, there's going to be lots of oxygen available. So even though there's not a lot of food, you don't really have to worry about oxygen so much when you're in the middle. Now, there is a point where you hit an actual, it's called an oxygen minimum zone. And what's happening is you have all of these organisms who live in the area who are taking in that oxygen, but there's no organisms in that area who are replacing that oxygen. So now you're so far down, you don't really have a lot of that diffusion going on, because again, it gets sucked up the lower and lower you go. It's being used by other organisms. Not to mention, the pressure is actually making these oxygen molecules smaller for themselves, so you need more for the same processes that you would like on normal land, where the oxygen molecules are big and you can just take a nice big breath. So once you get to the oxygen minimum zone, what happens is these organisms are all sucking out the oxygen from the water, but there's no photosynthetic organisms to replace that oxygen. So nobody's doing photosynthesis and producing, therefore, oxygen as a byproduct. So unlike at the surface levels, you have that oxygen coming from the surface and organisms that are doing photosynthesis. At a certain point in this oxygen minimum zone, you have neither. So you have no oxygen coming in from above, and any oxygen you have is being sucked up by organisms, and it's not being replaced by anything. So at that point, you do get a lot of problems because you're short on oxygen, and that's another reason that some of these organisms are going to be a lot smaller, and because you can't sustain a huge body with very, very little oxygen, and therefore you'd have to be smaller to be able to utilize what little oxygen remains in that oxygen minimum zone. Now, when we talk about the mesopelagic, remember, this is the top of, the epipelagic is the very, very top, and now we're getting into the dark, the twilight zone. So the mesopelagic is the twilight zone. And again, it does have some light, not good light, not enough for a lot of photosynthesis to happen. Definitely not enough for like algae and stuff like that to survive, but there are bacteria and stuff that can utilize just a little bit of sunlight that is there. The mesopelagic does lie right next to the epipelagic. So there are organisms that will go from the mesopelagic up into the epipelagic to feed. So if you have in the epipelagic lots of organisms that can do photosynthesis and everybody's producing all these nutrients, and you're in the mesopelagic zone just below that, all you have to do is swim up, eat, and come back down. That's that vertical migration that we talked about last week. It's really, really important for a lot of these organisms in the mesopelagic, because there's not a ton of food there. I mean, there's definitely food. That deep sea scattering layer, that's going to be in the mesopelagic. And then at night, they're all going to move up to the epipelagic together. They're going to feed on the photosynthetic organisms that are up here in the epipelagic. And then at night, during the daytime, they're going to go back down to where it's safe and dark so that they don't get eaten themselves. So again, they're going to go from that bottom, darkness and safety in the daytime to up to the dark at night to feed. So they're feeding on at night on photosynthetic organisms. So those are vertical migrators, and that's really important. And they're not only feeding on photosynthetic organisms, but they kind of travel up as this big group, and they can feed on each other. They can feed on the organisms up there. But the whole point is that there's a lot more food in the epipelagic than the mesopelagic. So that's why they leave the mesopelagic, the safety of the mesopelagic, to go up to the epipelagic where there's a lot more organisms, but therefore a lot more food. So again, vertical migrators are really abundant in these mesopelagic areas. So days are spent in the mesopelagic, hiding in the darkness, and at night, when it's dark, then they go up to the epipelagic, and then they feed, and then they come back down during the daytime to hide. The thermocline, remember a cline is a rapid change, and a thermocline is a rapid change in temperature. Okay, so when we're at the top, it's beautiful and it's sunny and it's warm and the water is being heated by the air and the sunlight. But then as you move down, deeper and deeper and deeper, it's going to get darker and darker and darker. So at a certain point when you don't ever reach any kind of sun, it's going to look like this. It's going to be like warm. Oh, it's getting a little colder, a little colder. Oh, now it's drastically cold. That's that thermocline. Okay, so the biggest thermocline that you're going to hit is going to be in the mesopelagic. So that's where the very top of the mesopelagic is going to be kind of close to the epipelagic, a little bit warmer. The bottom of the mesopelagic is nowhere near the epipelagic. It's near the bathypelagic. It's dark. It's cold. So that's where you're going to get that slowly, 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 boom, drastic temperature decrease here in the mesopelagic. Pressure, obviously you're going below 200 meters. So now the pressure is on. Pressure is on. It's literally like the pressure keeps intensifying every 33 feet you go down. So when you're talking about the mesopelagic, you're over 1,000 feet down, or 1,000 meters down. That's a lot of atmosphere. So the pressure is intense. So that's another thing that these vertical migrators have to deal with. They have to deal with decreasing and increasing temperatures. They have to deal with decreasing and increasing pressures. So if you stay at depth, the pressure is going to be the same. You know, you're acclimated to that pressure. But if you're going up and down, the pressure is going to change. It's going to increase. It's going to decrease. It's going to do all sorts of crazy things to you. So that's something that these vertical migrators actually have to deal with to be able to vertically migrate. And not all organisms can. So it depends kind of how you evolved. If you evolved to be a vertical migrator or you didn't. Because non-vertical migrators can't really migrate. And we're going to see why in just a second. So here we have a vertical migrator, and here we have a non-vertical migrator. So this guy right here is known as a lanternfish. You can see all these little dots going along both of their sides of their bodies. Right here, these are known as photophores. Photo meaning light. These are essentially little bioluminescent lights that these guys have, and this is very common in the meso and the bathypelagic. A little less common in the bathypelagic, but they're used to communicate, they're used to find prey, they're used to attract prey, they're used to find mates, all these useful things, so they can kind of flash their colors at each other to kind of communicate a little bit. Or they flash their colors to deter prey, predators, or they flash their colors to attract prey. So they can use it to get away from, you know, being eaten, or they can use it to eat, essentially. Now, if we notice these are 10 centimeters and 15 centimeters, these guys are pretty small. Like, both of these fish are pretty small. This is a lanternfish right here. This is looks like a viperfish right here. Viperfish or dragonfish, one of the two. They look almost identical. Long eel-like bodies. Notice they're both dark in color. Again, that dark color is going to help them blend in to that darkness that they're already in. They both have relatively big eyes because in the mesopelagic, there is still light. They're communicating via these photophores. There is still that twilight zone. You do still have a little bit of light. Especially this guy. He's a vertical migrator. He's going to go up in the shallows at nighttime. And if it's a full moon, he can detect that light. So you do need big eyes in this mesopelagic area. Now, some of the differences. So again, large mouth. That's for grabbing any kind of prey that's around because you need to eat whatever prey is around. Like if you find it, you got to be able to eat it. So these large mouths are usually extendable. So they take like a normal mouth size and they can actually like unhinge the jaw and go even farther forward. So it'd be like me eating all the way out to like here, which would look crazy, but these guys are really good at it. So again, they have the photophores, they have the large mouth, they have the large eyes, and they're usually dark in color. That's because they live in the same type of environment. Now, the lanternfish over here is a vertical migrator. So he's the one who's going to go from that mesopelagic during the daytime and at night go up to the epipelagic to feed. So he needs well-developed bones, right? Strong bones. He's taking in a very different pressure if he's at the bottom or if he's at the top. So again, that pressure, if you go from the top and now you're at a less pressure and you swim to the bottom, if you had weak, thin little brittle bones like him, potentially that pressure could crack your bones and break your bones. So if you're going to be able to go to these different pressures, you're going to need big, strong bones. You're also going to need big, strong muscles. If you're swimming potentially 1,000 meters every single night, you got to be a really good swimmer to do that. So one, you're going to want really strong muscles as opposed to this guy who is weak, kind of flabby muscles. In fact, if you actually touch these guys, they feel really squishy. You're just like, oh my God, is that... So like you touch us and it's kind of like muscle. But imagine almost like petting Jell-O. Yeah, petting Jell-O, that's kind of what these guys feel like. They're really soft and kind of squishy. Like if you push too hard, you could just push your thumb right through the entire fish. It's crazy. But these guys have, again, well-developed bones, good strong muscles, and they have a swim bladder. So the non-vertical migrators, no swim bladder. The vertical migrators, swim bladder. So, essay question on an exam. I don't know. I could maybe ask you what's the difference between vertical migrators and non-vertical migrators. You know, tell me some similarities, tell me some differences. Okay? Literally, it's right here. All right. Any questions again, guys? Shoot me emails, ask me, whatever you guys got to do. Okay, so these non-vertical migrators, these guys who are not actually going from the mesopelagic back up to the epipelagic, they don't need a swim bladder because they're staying at the same depth, essentially. So swim bladder is going to allow these fish to kind of increase or decrease the gases inside said bladder to help with their buoyancy. So as they go up, those gases are going to expand, so they release some out of their gas bladder, or their swim bladder. As they go down, right, the gas is going to shrink because of the pressure, and therefore they may need to add more gas to keeping neutral buoyancy. And neutral buoyancy is very important in these areas because there's no bottom. There's no resting. There's no like, oh, let me just hang out here. No, there's no resting whatsoever. So that means you have to constantly keep swimming or stay afloat. So again, sinking all the way to the bottom if you're a mesopelagic fish isn't going to be good for you. You don't belong all the way down there, and the pressure is just going to be intense. So you kind of want to stay where you're at. And so having neutral buoyancy is really, really important for these guys. So if you are a non-vertical migrator, having a swim bladder is kind of pointless. And it's energy costly to inflate it and deflate it. And so you wouldn't want to keep inflating and deflating it. You would just want to stay neutral, and therefore you don't even need a swim bladder. What else? Again, they have weak, flabby muscles. They're really kind of watery. Because really, if you're neutrally buoyant and you're staying at the same depth, the same pressure, the same everything, all you're doing is kind of moving back and forth. So you're not even working that hard. And at that depth, you're not experiencing waves. You're not experiencing currents. I mean, yes, deep sea, slow moving currents, but not like anything you have to really fight against. So they don't really need these big, strong muscles. They kind of just hang out and they swim slowly and they just cruise until they find a fish, and then they cruise and swim slowly, and they're not really going anywhere, you know? Again, they're usually pretty small. So people think, oh, that viper fish with the big jaw and the big teeth, it looks so scary. Yeah, he's also about that big. He's really not anything that we would have to worry about. But being smaller means that one, you use less oxygen, and two, you use less nutrients. So you don't need as much energy if you stay small. So if there's not a lot of food around, being small is actually beneficial to you because you don't need to feed yourself as much because you're smaller. What else? Again, those long teeth, those long sharp jaws are really kind of very common in this mesopelagic area because you need to be able to get whatever food is around. So whoever swims up to you, you need to be able to eat him. So essentially that's why everybody has those big mouths and those big sharp grabbing teeth, because you can't let that potential prey swim away from you, because then maybe that's the last prey you're going to see in like a week. So you could potentially die if you don't have enough food. So you want those big jaws to just kind of be able to grab whatever food that you can actually get. So again, that's what we see right here. This is a classic example of an extendable jaw. So normally they're just kind of tucked back right here. They have these really big, these big mandibles, and so they'll extend forward and outward, and they'll be able to, again, spear with their sharp teeth and then grab and pull into their mouth whatever prey is around. So big, extendable, biting teeth, biting jaws, all that. Very important in the mesopelagic, and that's why you'll see the viperfish and the dragonfish, again, same kind of thing with these big jaws. Hatchetfish, the same thing. Big, extendable jaws. Again, we don't really need a swim bladder if we're not going up and down. If we're not one of these vertical migrators, we don't really need it. We're already going to be neutrally buoyant. We're going to kind of stay where we're at. So there's no point in having a swim bladder, and therefore saves you energy to, not have to fill it up or reduce it. Transparency is a big one in the depth. Everyone's going to be dark colored or transparent or red. Remember, those are the three colors that are like the best in the deep sea. When you're talking about the mesopelagic, remember this is the twilight zone. There is still a little bit of light, so counter shading is a good one here. So a lot of these fish that you'll see and these other organisms will be counter shaded to kind of hide either, remember counter shading, when you look up from the bottom, they appear white from their belly. They blend into the white of the sun from, coming from above. When you look at them from downwards, you see the dark of their back, and so therefore when you look down into the deep dark bottom, they blend into the dark. So no matter which way you look at them, they're still blending into that environment. Let's see. Big eyes. We already talked about the big eyes. They need to be able to pick up whatever light is there. Even if it's the tiniest little bit of sunlight that's barely penetrating all the way down there, they need to be able to pick up on that. Also, picking up on those photophores, that bioluminescence that we talked about. They're going to flash their little lights at each other, and therefore you need to be able to see that if you're actually going to be able to communicate or mate or attract prey, anything like that. Again, bioluminescence, which we just talked about, very, very important. Those photophores are the actual little dots themselves. So bioluminescence is the creation of light, right? Bioluminescence, you're living and creating light. But the photophores themselves are the actual dots that go along the body. So if on a test or a practical I ask you, what is this little dot right here on this fish? You wouldn't tell me bioluminescence. You would say it's a photophore. If I ask you what it does, then you can say it does bioluminescence. So that's the difference between a photophore and bioluminescence. This bioluminescence is usually, these photophores are usually located on the belly side, which is a little bit different. This is actually known as counter-illumination. So again, when you're looking, if you're say below a fish and you're looking up and you kind of cast a shadow, now if you have all these lights on you, you're like, you kind of get confused about where the lights are actually coming from. And therefore you get confused about the fact that that may or may not actually be a fish or a potential prey item. So usually only on the ventral side, the belly side, and that's because when organisms are below them looking up, they kind of see those lights and they're like, are those stars? Is that a sun? Is it natural light? Is it a fish? It doesn't look like a fish. There's all these just little lights broken up. So then you don't know if they're like little small organisms all, next to each other, or if it's a bigger organism. It's kind of again confusing. So this is known as counter illumination, having your photophores on your belly instead of like on your back or on your sides or something like that. Hemoglobin. So these guys, we're talking about chordates mostly, like these fishes that we're looking at. They do have hemoglobin. They are just like us. And hemoglobin is used to carry oxygen throughout your body to your cells. Well, their hemoglobin is actually modified a little bit to work at really low oxygen levels. So yes, the oxygen level is way lower than it would be at, say, the surface. And so to keep them moving, to keep them alive, their hemoglobin basically functions at a lower level. And so it still function, it still transfers oxygen throughout your body. It's just used to doing it at a lot lower level than say our hemoglobin, which would carry a lot more oxygen, and larger, obviously, because the oxygen would be bigger. Here it's all compressed oxygen. So they can actually, their blood can actually work at lower levels to survive in the oxygen poor environment. Here's a couple of examples of fish that live in the mesopelagic zone. So we talked about the viper fish and the dragonfish. Again, they have these lures that come out here. We're going to talk about those in just a second. The lure itself is the actual string part here. And then at the that's the rod. That would be the rod. And the lure would be the very end. So if you think of a fishing pole, right, your pole, that would be the rod. And then what's on the very end of your string, that would be your lure. And that would be to, again, attract fish to bite onto your lure so you can catch them. Same thing here. So the rod would be the long part, and the lure would be the little part at the end. Typically the little part at the end is either glowing or it has like some little kind of appendages, so they can almost wave it like this and kind of say like, oh look, I have a little, or I'm a little organism with all these little legs, come eat me. And then they get closer and closer and closer, and then they realize, actually, no, he's got a really huge mouth right here that he's going to eat you with. So again, this would be the rod. The very end would be the lure. The lure is also known as an esca. E-S-C-A. Esca. That is the actual end of the rod, the lure part of it. So it can be a glowing esca. It can be a little, frilly esca. Sometimes they look like little fishes esca. Again, so that end part right here, that lure part, is known as an esca. E-S-C-A. Esca. We have our hatchetfish, just like in Finding Nemo. Everyone's so afraid of the scary hatchetfish and anglerfish, and with the big teeth and the big bodies. Yeah, I hate to break it to you guys. Anglerfish and hatchetfish with these big, scary, big mouths, and they're about that big. They're really not that scary. In fact, Nemo himself would have been about that big, so I think it would have been a competition who would have actually eaten who. The lanternfish, this is the one that we talked about already. You can see all of these little white dots. Those are the photophores. Same thing on the viperfish, the hatchetfish, the bristlemouth. Most of these guys here, especially on the top, are all going to have those photophores. Now, not everyone has the photophores, right? So we have a Barracuda right here. We have a lancetfish right here. These guys do not. But notice they're all still relatively small in size. I mean, this lancetfish is the largest by far in size, but his body is actually very skinny and thin, hence the name lanceletfish, because a lancelet, member is that long, skinny organism that we learned about already. So you can have photophores, you cannot. It's kind of up to your feeding mechanism. You can sometimes have lures and esca or not, or lures or esca, same thing, lure, esca. Yeah, this little bristlemouth fish right here, these lanternfish are very, very common. In fact, I think we have about 15 to 20 species of lanternfish off of our coast, and the only difference between them is the number and placement of photophores. So you're lucky that I can't actually give you guys this, because there are, I mean, I had to do this when I was in school. You had to like look at 15 different fish and draw their little photophores and how they're different, and then try to figure out which species they are based on their photophore placement. So you are lucky we're not doing that in this class. So yeah, common fish that are found in the mesopelagic. Lanternfish, hatchetfish, dragonfish, viperfish, very, very common. Lanceletfish, barracudinas, all sorts of good stuff here. All right, zooplankton is very common in the mesopelagic because, again, that zooplankton is part of that scattering, that deep sea scattering layer that does vertical migrations. So they hang out in the mesopelagic, they're hiding, they're like, hey, it's dark and I'm totally, you know, I could totally be eaten by anybody at any second, so they hang out in the dark, and then at nighttime they'll actually go up to the epipelagic and they'll feed on that phytoplankton. So there are a lot of, it's not just fishes, there are a lot of zooplankton as well. Jellies are here. You know, things like copepods, arrowworms, all sorts of good stuff found in the mesopelagic style. Cephalopods and octopuses are also common in the mesopelagic. We learned a little bit about things like the vampire squid, right? The vampire squid, the Dumbo octopus, those are all deep sea organisms, deep sea mollusca that live in the just pelagic zone, typically in the mesopelagic zone. You get the giant squid that live even farther down, which is just crazy. So yeah, it's not just fishes in this area. There's a lot of productive life here in these areas, despite the fact that they're being little food and at some parts low oxygen. Now, once we actually get down even farther past the twilight zone, remember, now we're into the bathy pelagic zone, the abyssal pelagic zone, and finally the Hadal zone, the deep sea trenches. It is uniformly dark, always. There's absolutely no light. It is uniformly cold. It is about 3 degrees Celsius, which 0 is freezing, so it's cold. There's a ton of pressure because you're just under so much water at this point. That's pretty much it. So it's dark, it's cold, it's, you know, there's a lot of pressure, but it's always consistent. It's consistently cold, it's consistently pressurized, it's consistently dark, right? These conditions are actually very stable, and therefore you don't, even like the mesopelagic zone, you don't have any of that fluctuation that you would, say like in the intertidal. You're not going through 40, 50 degree temperature differences in a day. You are living your entire life at the same temperature, at the same pressure, at the same darkness. So the conditions are usually pretty stable, as we would say. Harsh, but stable. There's no counter shading needed here because there's no light coming from above. Remember that mesopelagic is still the twilight zone. You can still see the light penetrating. So when you look up, you can still see a little bit of light. In the bathy and lower, you can't see anything. So there's no point in actually having counter shading. Bioluminescence is here. It's not as common as it would be in, say, the mesopelagic, but it is there. As you go deeper, however, it does decrease. So the top of the bathy pelagic, absolutely. The middle, sure. Probably some, you're getting closer to the abyssal, less and less. So as you move away from the mesopelagic zone, you're actually going to have less bioluminescence. So it does kind of decrease. It's still there, it's just a lot less, especially as you go deeper and deeper and deeper. It's almost like a sliding scale. It just kind of goes down and down and down. So for this one, when we're actually into the bathy pelagic zone and lower, now our photophores are going from our ventral side, our belly side, to kind of located around our head. And this could be for a number of different reasons. Mostly, you're not trying to break up your body morphology anymore, because unless you're flashing your photophores, nobody's going to see you. There's no light. Who's going to see you? So in this case, it would be a little bit more for attracting things like mates or attracting prey. So if I flash a bunch of lights, somebody could be like, I wonder what you are, and they come a little bit closer to you, and then they realize, oh, you're right next to my mouth, and I just got eaten. Crap. So again, that would be located more on the face and the head side than on the belly side. So mesopelagic, located on the belly. Bathypelagic and lower, located more on the face. So easy test question, something like that. Eyes are not so important anymore because there's not a lot of light. Yes, you still need to do, you need to detect those photophores that are flashing, but that's about it, right? You're not going to be traveling into the twilight zone. You're not really going to be looking for a whole lot, so the eyes are a lot smaller than they would be in the mesopelagic zone. Another easy test question, what is the difference between the mesopelagic and the bathypelagic? Right, you're not going to have your vertical migrators in the bathypelagic. You're not going to have big eyes. You're not going to have, probably not going to have a swim bladder because you're not going anywhere. You're not going to have, photophores on your belly. You're going to have them around your face. So, things like that could easily be on the test questions. Let's see. Pressure-resistant enzymes. So enzymes kind of catalyze reactions inside your body. They're basically used to keep you alive. So pressure can affect the shape of the protein. An enzyme is a protein, and proteins all work on the shape of it. So if you increase the pressure, you could potentially crush your enzyme, and now it won't be able to function well. So any of these organisms that live in the bathy and lower are under such intense pressure, just like using a different type of hemoglobin or a different kind of a modified hemoglobin, these guys have a modified enzyme that is resistant to pressure. So as the pressure increases, you're not actually smushing your protein. So you can still work and live, and yay. Let's see. A lot of these guys in the bathypelagic when it comes to fishes are going to be like the mesopelagic fishes who are not vertical migrators. So flabby muscles, no swim bladder, weak bones, stuff like that. That's kind of going to be characteristic of all of your non-migrating deep sea fishes. So even the meso and the bathy, the fishes are the same when it comes to your non-migrating fishes. And remember, in the bathy, there are no migrating fishes. Nobody is vertically migrating as a fish in the bathypelagic. Too deep. And again, similarities would be big teeth and big mouth. Like, you still need to eat whoever you come across in the bathypelagic. So big teeth, dark in color, all of those still, dark in color. They're just kind of naturally dark in color. But big teeth are still really important in the deep sea. Here's a fun guy. This is one of my favorites. This is an anglerfish. This was the guy that was in Nemo, a close relative of the hatchetfish. But these little anglerfish right here are called anglerfish because of their escas, right? Their lures and their escas. So this again is going to be the rod. We have the lure right here. Remember, another word for lure is esca, E-S-C-A. Notice how small the eyes are compared to the hatchetfish and the dragonfish, or sorry, the dragonfish and the viperfish that we just looked at, and even the lanternfish. They had relatively large eyes, but now we look at the anglerfish and they're very, very small compared to their counterparts. Still black in color, still very large jaw, very sharp teeth, but really flabby. I mean, he kind of even looks flabby, right? He doesn't even look like a good swimmer. And they're not. You can kind of swim there like, Rrr. They kind of do this little retarded swim. It's actually pretty funny to watch. But it's because of these weak bones, these flabby muscles. They don't really need to swim. Mostly they're kind of floating around with these deep sea currents, and only when they have to like dart at something are they actually like swimming. So not super great at it, especially with the control. Look at this little pectoral fin right here. It's like a T-Rex of the ocean. Big mouth and little arms. Yeah, so again, this lack of streamlining in their body is because they're not really good swimmers. They're certainly not going far distances. They're just kind of swimming around casually in the deep sea, doing their thing in the dark, total darkness. And there's not even a lot of organisms down there, so they have a lot of space in between them. It's not like you'd be swimming in a, oh, sorry, buddy. Huh. It really doesn't happen quite like that. It's, yeah, everything's pretty small, it's really dark, and everybody's really big teeth. If you're a fish. And flabby muscles. You should go to the gym. Alright, so the deep sea anglerfish is awesome. In fact, all anglerfish I think are really, really awesome. They do have different lures depending on the species. And they are, you know, some are bioluminescent, some are just fleshy looking. And they do a lot of really interesting things. Anglerfish. We're going to see some videos on some fun anglerfish facts. But they do have that allure to attract prey. As one of their interesting behaviors. As another one, it's a reproductive behavior. And remember, I love to tell you guys fun sex facts about the ocean. Well, here's a good one. It is called sexual parasitism, where one attaches onto the other as a parasite and lives its entire life as a sexual parasite. Yes, not nearly as fun as it sounds. Essentially what happens is they are sexually dimorphic, and remember that just means that the two sexes have two different morphs, or they look different. So in this case, the female is much larger than the male. She is a big honkin' female, and the male is really tiny. And what happens is, because this is the deep sea, it's very hard to find mates. Essentially, everybody's swimming around totally blind. And so if you run into someone, you don't know if it's another fish. You don't know if it's the same species as you. You don't know if it's the same sex as you. You have no idea what's going on. You're like, I don't know if I'm going to try to eat you or mate with you, or eat you or mate with you. That's pretty much the two options. Or be eaten by you. I guess that would be the third option. So to increase the reproductive success, what happens is the female, as she swims along, actually releases a hormone. So this hormone gets released into this water, and it's like a chemical cue. It's like a chemical scent. And the male is attracted to it. So the male will be just swimming around, and he goes, and he picks up the scent, and he will follow her. He will follow her until he finds her. Once he finds her, he will bite onto her genital opening, and then fuse his face to her body. Permanently. Forever. And essentially, he just becomes completely useless except for his reproductive organs. So essentially, she gets a pair of gonads attached to her and then swims around forever with a little sperm pouch that she can utilize whenever she wants to. Crazy sex facts, guys, in marine biology. What did I promised you fun, crazy sex facts the whole semester, and this is what you got. Sexual parasitism. The male attaches onto the female. He basically becomes completely useless. He just lives off of her nutrients like a parasite, and she gets a, free gonads whenever she wants to reproduce. Win-win! Yes, we're going to show a video on that. We're actually going to see two videos on it. One less serious than the other, but both with really interesting facts. So we will see that in just a second. So, enjoy your videos.
Here we will learn true facts about the anglerfish. The female anglerfish comes in many shapes, colors, and shades of ugly. It's like a rainbow of ugly. The male anglerfish is tiny by comparison, like a tiny little baby. He attaches himself to the female by biting her and then digesting part of his face so he fuses with her flesh. He then atrophies, losing his digestive organs, brain, heart, and eyes, and winds up nothing more than a pair of gonads, which release sperm when needed. Hey there, pretty lady. Nice gonads. To the female anglerfish, the human male is a very loud, annoying, and unnecessarily complicated pair of gonads. The anglerfish is a master of disguise, hiding itself among the sand and rocks of the ocean floor. Here, an anglerfish compares its camouflaging skills with that of a flounder, also a master. Holy crap, what the fuck? To hunt, the anglerfish waves things in front of its mouth that its prey is attracted to. Here, the anglerfish waves a lovely pashmina shawl, just the size for an unsuspecting shrimp. Here, another one presents a lovely pair of leggings. And here, a decorative hat feather. Sadly, the shrimps and their vanity pay the ultimate price. Death. The deep-sea anglerfish collects glowy bacteria in its wavy thing to create a tiny little light. Because it's dark as hell down there, and someone needs to light up that pretty lady.
Angler! This time.
It lives in total darkness at depths of up to a mile below sea level, and what has been referred to as the midnight zone. Down here, don't be afraid of the dark. Be afraid of the light. The light is a lure wielded by our champion of the weird, the deep-sea anglerfish. The lure is created by bioluminescent bacteria that live inside the angler. It drifts through the water, flashing its beacon, waiting for something to take the bait. This squid thinks it's found an easy meal. A fatal mistake. The squid was smaller than the angler, but had it been bigger, the anglerfish is prepared. This far down, meals are few and far between, so to make the most of every opportunity, this anglerfish has evolved a distended jaw and expandable stomach. Want more weird? We have it. This is a black devil angler. A female, to be precise. She is after this fish. It's not a meal, it's her mate. This is the male black devil angler. A specialized scent organ locks in on the ladies. If it's difficult to find food this deep, it's even more difficult to find a girlfriend. Deep-sea anglerfish solve the problem by having extremely clingy relationships and never letting go. Ever. The male bites into her belly. His body releases an enzyme. That dissolves the skin under the bite and fuses his mouth to her body. Then, the two become one. He will draw sustenance from her for the rest of his life. In return, the female has a ready supply of sperm for whenever she's ready to mate. Thank you, deep-sea anglerfish, for bringing so much weirdness into our lives.
Okay, I hope you guys really enjoyed those videos and found them very entertaining as well as informational. I know I always do. Alright, so let's talk about other reproductive methods, because this, sexual parasitism happens to work really great for this anglerfish, but it doesn't necessarily work for everybody. I mean, she, I guess, evolved for that reproductive strategy, and it works out great for them because they can actually find their mates. But not all organisms can actually do this sexual parasitism. I'm very glad that we can. Can you even imagine? No, just don't imagine. That would just be weird. But okay. So other reproductive methods include, using other pheromones and chemicals like that. Now, those are species specific. So the pheromone that she's laying out is something that he picks up on and that's specific to his species. It wouldn't do her any good to attract another species, and potentially could lead her to get eaten by some kind of prey if they can pick up on those chemical cues as well. So really it's kind of species specific with these chemical cues and these pheromones that they release, which is great because then you're only attracting your potential mate and not, a potential predator. So other organisms will do this as well. They'll use pheromones, they'll use hormones and stuff like that to help, increase the chances of finding mates in the deep sea, because it's very hard to find anything in the deep sea, let alone, like the video said, a girlfriend. Another really important thing that some of these organisms will do is, well, they won't do, but they've evolved to deal with is being hermaphrodites. So we've already talked lots about hermaphrodites, but this is really useful for you if, you don't know who you're going to run into. You happen to run into another one of your species, great, who's not trying to eat you, even better, but you're both males. That's not really going to work. So if you're both, then that actually doubles your reproductive success because you can fertilize the first one while he fertilizes your eggs at the same time. So your sperm was able to fertilize their eggs and vice versa. And so you're actually getting twice the amount of reproductive success that you would if you were, say, just a male or just a female. And on the off chance you happen to run into a mate of the opposite sex of your same species, again, it's just kind of low when it comes to these chances. And so you're trying to increase the reproductive success any way you can. So being a simultaneous hermaphrodite actually works out really well for you because anybody that you run into, you can end up mating with them, sometimes twice over. Just like those sea hares that we learned about, how they can, you know, reproduce with the one in front of them and the one in front of them, et cetera, et cetera. You guys remember the fun sex facts that I love to tell you about in the semester. I promised you lots of fun sex facts, and I delivered. So again, sexual parasitism is actually really rare, but quite successful, especially for that anglerfish. So if you don't have that option, then you can just be a hermaphrodite, and then again increases the chance of whoever you do find being able to mate with them. All right, so now we're actually getting down to the bottom layer, the actual benthic zone. So remember, when you're in the meso and the bathy, it's really hard to find food because everything just kind of floats to the bottom. So anything that dies, including those little tiny coccolithophores or those big whale carcasses, that's all nutrients. But it's going to float right past the meso and the bathy, and it's going to finally settle on the abyssal plain, the benthic bottom. You can think of this as like the ocean bottom. So the abyssal pelagic would be the pelagic just above the abyssal plain. But the abyssal plain would be like, think of like the ocean floor. Now this is going to be different when we actually talk about like deep sea trenches and stuff like that. That's like, that would be like a crack or like a canyon on the seafloor. But typically we're talking about the seafloor as the abyssal plain. What else? Since everything that dies is eventually going to float to the bottom and then stay there. Remember, we don't have a lot of waves. We don't have a lot of nutrients getting stirred up here. So any organic material that's going to fall and settle there is just going to stay there. So you have things like a lot of decomposers. You're going to have those deposit feeders again. And again, as you know, whatever size dead body you are, meaning the microscopic coccolithophore, the huge whale, there are going to be scavengers who are going to scavenge those and decomposers who are going to decompose those bodies. So you're also going to have a lot of deposit feeders again who are going to be crawling along the bottom again, eating those sediments, taking out those organic nutrients, leaving the rest of the sediment intact. So now you actually have an abundant food source because anything that dies anywhere in the ocean is going to settle on the bottom. So now, unlike the meso and the bathy, we don't have this food shortage. We actually have a lot of food. So we're going to increase the diversity because we increase things like food availability. So that's all good things. When we look at here, let's see if I can fix that. There we go. When we look here, you can actually see a couple of common organisms that are found in the deep sea. A couple of guys are familiar. This is the ratfish, the chimeran that we've already learned about, right? That first cartilaginous, one of the first cartilaginous fishes. We have that hagfish, the one who expels all of that slime, right? Remember, they're deep sea scavengers. They're just crawling around the bottom blind, looking and smelling for dead bodies, things like whale carcasses and stuff like that. And then once they get them, they just scavenge them like crazy. We have some other things, again, eel-looking organisms. That eel shape is actually really common on the deep sea. It's really easy to swim with that eel shape. And again, you don't really need strong bones or big muscles because you're living in the bottom. You're living in the deep. It's really calm. It's really quiet in there, and therefore, you know, you don't need to fight against the current or the waves and stuff because it doesn't exist in the deep sea. This guy's always a fun one. This is called a tripod fish. It's because he kind of walks almost on a tripod with his little modified fins. And usually he's looking for organisms buried in the sediment. So that's what he's looking for. He's looking for food. But still a really cool looking guy there. We have lots of other organisms living in this area. Remember, we have an abundance of food now. So any kind of organism that lived on, especially a soft sandy bottom, you're going to find here. Like snails, crabs, worms, stuff like that. Very, very common on the deep sea, the bottom, the benthic floor. We have a lot of decomposing bacteria, which are really, really great because we have a lot of decomposing bodies. So these decomposing bacteria are really, really useful. But funny enough, they have kind of a unique metabolism because they live under such intense pressure. And this is true of a lot of organisms that live in the deep sea. They have very slow metabolisms. Meaning, you know, even slower, like 1,000 times slower than some of their counterparts that live up, you know, higher to the surface or even on land. True of many organisms in the deep sea because of the intense cold and the intense pressure. And so these organisms aren't, one, they're not moving very far or very fast at all. They're all pretty much neutrally buoyant if you're, say, a fish. And again, you have these very, very steady conditions. It's constantly cold. It's constantly a lot of pressure. It's constantly not really moving. So to get through, I mean, you can go very slowly and not actually burn off a lot of energy. And therefore, you don't require a lot of food. You don't burn through your oxygen as quickly. You just don't metabolize as fast. And therefore, you're very slow growing. However, a lot of these slow-growing organisms live for a really long time. If you have a super slow metabolism, that means your cells are dividing super slow too. So you think of just our lifespan, but getting played in slow motion over a really long time. That's kind of essentially what's going on in the deep sea. So you have some things like the Greenland shark, which actually can live up to, well, they just tested one a few years ago, and they found out that it's over 500 years old. This one shark is over 500 years old. So you're talking about like when Shakespeare was around, this shark was swimming the ocean. Like that's mind-boggling. It's just amazingly cool that some organisms can live that long because they are such slow-growing organisms and they have such a slow metabolism. So these bacteria can live under these like really intense pressures and deal with these really crazy conditions and still survive and thrive. Just like that Greenland shark can live, has a very slow metabolism and can live a really long time. Now, he's a really large organism, and they can get up to 20, 25 feet long. They're big. I mean, that's bigger than a great white. That's big, or as big as a great white. Big, big sharks. But they're also down in the depths, and they're swimming about that fast. So they're going very, very slow. They're not burning up a bunch of energy, and therefore they don't need to eat very often. So some of these sharks are eating once, twice, 3 times a year. They find a whale carcass, they feast on it, they have all these calories stored, they don't really burn any of them off, and they live for a very long time, which is great for them. However, any kind of slow-growing, long-lived organism is really always susceptible to things like predation via, humans usually. So if we start taking a lot of them, it takes them a long time to reproduce. So they can really get hit by things like extinction and, just drops and heavy declines in their populations because they are so long-lived and so slow-growing. So that's always a problem. But these bacteria typically don't have that kind of problem. They're living in these very, very deep sea conditions with high pressure and low temperatures, and therefore they can survive for long periods of time. And they're fixing these unusable nutrients that we can't necessarily access. We can't suck up that phosphate and that's carbon dioxide and turn it into usable bits of nutrients, but these bacteria can. So we're going to see that coming up in a little bit when we talk about the hydrothermal vents. Really, really useful, really amazing things these decomposing bacteria are. Lots of sediments, obviously, we're at the bottom of the ocean, so there's going to be sediments again. We finally have that benthic structure again. And those sediments are covered in any kind of dead body you can possibly think of. Like I said, the microscopic coccolithophore or the giant whale carcass. All of that is going to be replenishing energy and nutrients back into the sediment and soil. And therefore, these are going to be very rich, productive areas. You have lots of nutrients, lots of food sources at these rich soils. You also have a lot of myofauna. Remember, we have soft, sandy bottoms, which means we're going to have little tiny organisms that live in between those soft, sandy bottoms. Therefore, the myofauna abundance is going to go way up. And any organism that eats the myofauna, like those deposit feeders, they're not just eating the organics that are sitting on top, they're also eating the little animals that are actually living in between the grains of sand as well. So, very, very productive areas these sandy bottom abyssal plains are. So, lots of deposit feeding, lots of sediments, lots of organisms that live in and among the sediments. So we kind of briefly mentioned on this, but some things that live on the bottom of the ocean are actually way bigger than you would expect them to be. So in the meso and the bathypelagic, food is scarce, oxygen can be scarce. But here in the deep sea, the abyssal plain, it's kind of like the opposite. Now we have a ton of food. We have a ton of these different, resources that we need. And so some of these organisms actually get way larger than they would, or they're way larger than we see their counterparts. So we have things like tiny little gill isopods that live in the, gills of fishes that are really, really little. And you go to the bottom of the ocean and they're massive now. They're the size of footballs and small dogs. And you're like, wait a minute, this is crazy. And that's, it's actually called deep sea giganticism. Because you see these normally organisms like these tube worms that would be, 4 to 6 centimeters long. Now they're 4 to 6 feet long. It's crazy how big that some of these organisms can get. So you do see a lot of these deep sea organisms that live on the bottom, not so much in the water, but in the bottom, really, really big. I mean, the giant squid lives in the water. Big. So deep sea giganticism, absolutely a thing, and kind of crazy. So up top, we see in between the fingers of someone this little tiny isopod that was probably pulled out of a gill of a fish. And here in the palm of someone's hand, we see this massive isopod. So like I said, some of these guys get really, really big compared to their counterparts that live in the shallower waters. So deep sea gigantism, tube worms, crabs, these isopods, they get really big, and they're invertebrates, so they're not normally that big. They're usually restricted on land, but due to whatever physiological, restriction they have. But we don't see that so much in these deep sea communities, which is just crazy. So yeah, we already talked about how they can have, really long lives, really long lifespans because of this slow metabolism. Anything with a slow metabolism is going to grow very, very slowly, and therefore take a long time to grow and a long time to sexually mature as well. So a lot of these guys will lay larger, more well-developed eggs just as a reproductive success to make sure that they put in the parental care, because you're not going to reproduce for sometimes up to 20 years. They mature really late in life, and therefore to increase whatever reproductive success you will have, you want to make sure that you put parental care into those offspring. So therefore it's really, really important to have, less eggs, not like the broadcast spawners. You want less eggs, but you really want you want to put that investment into them to make sure that they survive, because, if you're an old, long-lived organism, you probably only get a few chances to reproduce throughout your life, and therefore you really need to make sure that one sticks and survives. And that's true of all long-lived, slow-growing organisms. Like us, it's really important to put enough parental care into those offspring so that they do survive. Unlike the broadcast spawners, which are just like, I don't know, I'm going to just produce several billion, and maybe some of you will survive, I don't know. But these longer-lived organisms, these slow-growing organisms, really have to put that investment in if they really actually want their offspring to survive. So again, any long-lived, slow-growing organism is going to be hit harder if you're actually removing some of those organisms out of the population, because they take so long to reproduce and therefore so long to actually replenish their numbers. I mean, if you live to 500 years old, you're probably not having a first kid until you're 25, 30. And then even then, you're probably not having another one for another few years after that. So small populations, slow-growing, long-lived organisms, including us. I mean, we don't even sexually mature until around 12, 13. That's a long time, and therefore it's really hard to, increase our populations because we take so long before we can reproduce. Unlike some of these organisms that can reproduce within their first year of life. So it just depends, and that's why some of these species get hit harder than others. It really depends on your reproductive timing and how quickly you can reproduce and how many times you can reproduce. So when it comes to these deep sea organisms, like the Greenland shark, it would just be, less, but they do put more care into it. Just like humans, when we actually have a baby, it is well developed. It can survive, not well, but it can physically survive outside of our bodies. And therefore, same thing with these guys, they usually have less eggs, but larger, more well-developed eggs, so the chance of their offspring surviving is way higher than, say, the broadcast spawners, which don't put so much parental care into it and just kind of, hope for the best when it comes to safety and abundance. So the more you produce, the more likely some will survive. But that's not true of these deep sea organisms. Usually it's larger, more well-developed eggs that they actually release to increase their survivability, because it takes a long time and a lot of effort to have an offspring, and therefore you want to maximize the chance that offspring will survive. Hydrothermal vents, we already talked a little bit about them. They're extremely productive areas of the deep sea. So when scientists back in the day were wondering, well, if the light doesn't penetrate that far and everything on Earth is based on light, is there any life at the bottom of the ocean? And we now know that yes, absolutely there is, because light is not the only initial source. Remember, there are photoautotrophs, self-feeders with light, but there's also chemoautotrophs, self-feeders with chemicals, essentially. And so, and those organisms can actually utilize other organic nutrients and stuff that maybe we cannot use, but they can actually turn those in from chemicals into actually usable bits of organics. And that's kind of the base of the food chain down at these deep sea hydrothermal vents, besides carcasses and stuff that float down there. But a lot of these guys are just, reliant on these keto autotroph bacteria to actually fix some of these nutrients into usable bits of nutrients that we can actually consume. So that's kind of the base of their food chain, is going to be these chemoautotrophs, self-feeding with these chemicals coming out of these hydrothermal vents. Things like sulfur, phosphates, stuff like that. So again, these bacteria are going to be the first, kind of the basal level of the food chain in these hydrothermal vents. Carcasses come and go, and they're not consistent, but these chemoautotroph bacteria are consistent. So they're living in these areas, and they're kind of providing the base of the food chain to turn these non-usable, you know, nutrients and stuff into actual usable bits of nutrients for some organisms like us. These guys are kind of crazy because they can not only withstand intense pressure and eat chemicals, but intense temperatures as well. So depending on these hydrothermal vents, be the white smokers, the black smokers, or the gray smokers, they're really, really high temperatures. So, I mean, we're talking some thousands of Fahrenheits, hundreds to thousands of Fahrenheits hot. And so some of these chemoautotroph bacteria can actually survive up to 250 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a lot. So it's, you know, hot, dark, crazy, cold, sulfur-filled waters that these guys are like, yeah, I'm good. That sounds perfect. I'm totally going to live here and thrive. But again, that's evolution. You know, everybody kind of finds their little nook and finds their way to live. So again, black smokers and white smokers are the two that we're going to be talking about. The white smokers are less hot than the black smokers. So when you have a white smoker, they're kind of pumping out this like white smoke is what it looks like. It's not actually smoke. It's actually like sediments and stuff that are coming out of the earth. And the black smokers are much, much hotter and pumping out even like nastier stuff. So some organisms that can live near the white smokers can't necessarily live near the black smokers, but some can. Some are just like, no matter what kind of smoker it is, they're just like loving all of the stuff that's coming out of it. So it's kind of crazy. Like I said, we have bacteria, we have crustaceans, there are fishes, there are worms. There's all sorts of these different organisms that thrive around these deep sea hydrothermal vents, which, you know, at first glance would be like, there's nothing that can survive these really hot temperatures, because you're essentially talking about freezing water right here and then like 500-degree-Celsius water right here. You're like, so now you actually do have that intense temperature fluctuation that we haven't seen for a really long time, almost since the intertidal, even worse than the intertidal. That's like a 500-degree temperature difference right there, around like areas immediately adjacent to these underwater hydrothermal vents, which is just crazy. So again, you can see a white smoker right here, kind of pluming out this like this almost like, again, white smoke. It's really mostly sediments and some organic material, inorganic materials. Here we have the black smokers right here. All of these little red things right here, those are actually all tube worms. So those are actually tube worms living at the mouth of the black smoker. And I told you the black smokers are the hotter ones. So you're talking about hundreds of degrees temperature, and the worms are living right next to it going, no, I'm good. That's totally fine. Loving this. So it's kind of crazy. And some of these worms actually have symbionts with these chemoautotroph bacteria that live inside their tissues, just like the zooxanthellae, that actually help them to survive in these areas and provide nutrients for them. So here are these giant worms that we're going to be looking at right here, these giant tube worms. They get up to 4 to 6 feet wide, and you're talking, you know, big round worms like that. They live in these huge tube structures that they build. And they just do great. But like I said, they do have these symbiotic bacteria that live inside their tissues, just like the zooxanthellae living in corals. So again, same kind of thing. The tube worms kind of create the structure, the reef. The chemoautotroph bacteria live inside of them. They help them feed. So now they're creating this big 3D living reef, this underwater reef, just like the corals and their zooxanthellae. So really, really important and crucial to these ecosystems that, you know, they have these symbiotic relationships. So again, here is the tube worm living inside the tube. This is their little plume. They're trying to feed right now. And again, they are trying to feed themselves. But living deep inside their tissues right here, we have these little bacteria. And they're actually going to take in things like the sulfide, the carbon dioxide that are coming out of these hydrothermal vents. They're going to take them inside their tissues, and they're going to synthesize them just like in photosynthesis. And they're going to create usable organic materials from it. So The bacteria gets those usable organics. The tube worm gets those usable organics. Anybody who eats the tube worm gets those usable organics. So now this is how we get that base of the food chain via these little tiny chemoautotrophic bacteria that live inside the cells of the tube worm. So really just like the coral reefs and the zooxanthellae, totally mutualistic, and allowing both of them to survive and thrive in these deep sea, really harsh environments. These hydrothermal vents aren't permanent. They don't last forever. Essentially, they're gases shooting out of the Earth's core. And sometimes all the gases are gone and, you know, tectonic plates shift, and sometimes they create them and sometimes they shift again and close them. So they're not always permanent, but when they're there, they are thriving environments, really productive, thriving environments. And so they can sustain a lot of life and the time being. And if you are a motile organism, if you're a tube worm, you're kind of screwed. Because again, the bacteria are getting their nutrients, their sulfides and stuff from the hydrothermal vents. The hydrothermal vents dry up, the bacteria dies off, the worm maybe dies off. But if you're one of those movable organisms like a fish or a crab, you just crawl to the next hydrothermal vent. And again, it's kind of these moving communities that are really productive while they exist. And with that, I will leave you with my terrible dad joke of the week. And I will see you guys very shortly for our very last lecture on human impacts. So this is it for ecosystems. You guys will have your final and fourth test on these ecosystem chapters right here, all the way from the intertidal zone, subtidal zone, estuaries, deep sea and open ocean. And then finally, we will have our human impact lecture coming up, and that will be the very last lecture before your final exam. So thank you guys for sticking with me once again. Hopefully have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you guys very shortly.